I think a podcast is supposed to have audio.
So, do you think dogs think?
Dogs definitely think, but their thoughts don't necessarily map to what we humans understand thinking to be. In fact, my favorite philosopher, Wittgenstein, said that the difference between a man and a lion is that neither can understand each other's world because neither can speak the other's language. In fact, language represents the fundamental barrier between ourselves and dogs, which,
But I mean, you know, like the dog's thoughts they're just vectors, right?
yeah, they are.
And a human, his thoughts are also probably just we can represent it by a vector in some high dimensional.
Humans are vectors as well, not just their thoughts.
And we could learn a mapping between dog thoughts and man thoughts.
So, see, I guess in principle it's possible, but it seems that the space is large enough that no academic paper could necessarily fit the full scope of the work.
So you have a human thought, and let's say we represent it by some vector v, and we have a dog thought, which is the corresponding low dimensional representation of the human thought, right? So we'll call it v dog.
Perhaps
But
it
I
is
mean,
it is unknown whether
it could
dog
just be
vectors are larger than human vectors. In fact, they are in linear algebraic terms, if you may, independent. And in fact, the learnings of a dog could in fact be larger. For example, humans are well aware that dogs have a higher sense of smell, and that in fact is a component of their language, which would perhaps make their vector slightly wider, perhaps even wider than the human vector is long.
what if we're focusing on the wrong thing with thoughts all the time? Like maybe you're right. Maybe we think that whatever we do is special, but what if like smell, like I don't do you know of a computer that can smell? What if smell is actually like that is intelligence?
Let me.
What if the dog is really a genius, and we could solve Go, humans can play Go, but we can't smell. So maybe if the hardest thing to imitate, the hardest thing to achieve computationally is the more intelligent act, and maybe the dog.
So I mean I never really understood all the press buzz about the AlphaGo announcement because it's actually been known in the academic community that goldfish have in fact uh, beaten all Go champions since the 1960s.
The
Uh,
the cookies or the fish.
the fish actually cookies don't have any sort of real intelligence. They are tasty, and they were in fact also presented as ceremonial awards for winning goldfish. However, there were some specious concerns that were raised back in 1982 that prevented, goldfish to food being used as a tournament prize ever since. And it's recently been replaced by algae.
So so back to thoughts. So like everything, right? All the neurons, like they fire.
All 100 billion of them.
They fire or they don't fire.
It's like a coin flip. It's like a quantum coin flip. Imagine, like, think about how your brain works. Like, it does all these complex patterns of firing and non-firing. And yet,
Can a brain fire and not fire simultaneously?
it does. It does. What if I told you you could put your brain in a box, and then in that brain put another brain to perceive it? And now I ask you the question, does the first brain exist?
Does a box exist?
Is there another brain outside the box?
What if it's like Donkey Kong? Donkey Kong is playing Donkey Kong, and Donkey Kong assumes everything in Donkey Kong. That's the universe. Everything. What Donkey Kong is can be explained by Diddy Kong or whoever is the other. Whatever else there is.
So that's a fundamentally
Bananas. Donkey Kong must think that Donkey Kong, that his cognition is made out of bananas. Because Donkey Kong, the whole universe is full of everything is made out of bananas or logs. I think barrels and logs.
Barrels, and sometimes there are frightening crocodiles that sit in these barrels.
And so Donkey Kong, all he can observe is bananas and crocodiles and barrels and
essentially
logs.
Essentially, you could boil down Donkey Kong
ropes.
to
There's ropes, right?
There are ropes indeed, vines, but ropes. Really, they're the same thing.
So, Donkey Kong. If you went into Donkey Kong and you talk to him, like you have Avatar, and you go
Avatar,
and you tell Donkey Kong that he's made out of silicon or something. There's no silicon.
So the brain in the vat is
a religious fanatic.
Who is a religious fanatic?
The person who believes in silicon.
Donkey Kong would think that?
I think so. So if you're a brain in a box inside a brain, how do you...
Are you a box or are you a brain?
How do you get a box inside a brain?
I mean, what's a thought?
Is the brain thinking?
What's a thought? You have an elephant in your brain.
Is the brain thinking?
You have the Eiffel Tower. The Crusades are in your brain.
So the brain, it's a pattern.
It's like a library.
Whoa.
A library of patterns. Think of what if you could go to a library and instantly find any book and instantly understand all the information in that book and recall it perfectly. Your brain does that 1 billion times every 1/1000th of a second. Whoa. I feel that I never truly understood machine learning until I started understanding Jesus. Jesus. So think about it. Jesus. Think about it. Like, how could you produce wine from water unless you had sample data that represented wine and also initial conditions that represented water, and then applied a linear model to obtain wine? Jesus was the first machine miming researcher.
But when you have a generative model, right, like usually the generative model can model the underlying distribution. You can sample from that distribution, right? But who created the distribution? If Jesus is machine learning, then what's God?
Well, God himself. So let's get back to the fish. So I think,
Jesus, because of Jesus.
Jesus deserves. I mean, like people, like see, this is what upsets me, right? Like I've spent, most of my life.
You ever look at a Jesus fish? It's kind of has the shape of it's like a manifold.
Well, God
Yeah.
created the manifold called Earth for us. And we ourselves are manifolds,
Do you
with
think
insects experiencing our bodies as manifolds. And they themselves composed of tiny little manifolds called bacteria.
do you think the Earth itself might actually be you walk around it, and because you're on a manifold, you see the Earth as being round. But what if the Earth is actually like a snake going throughout the universe, but you're just walking along the snake,
Well,
so
if
you're inside the Earth?
if the Earth was in more than 3 dimensions, we'd never know. Our brains don't have any recurrent neural networks, so we're doomed never to have the ability of understanding all truths about the world.
But say you were to represent the state of the brain, right? So you have a matrix, right? And it's an adjacency matrix of the neurons in the brain. So you have 100 billion neurons by 100 billion neurons, which means that your matrix has 10,000 trillion synapses, right? So now that matrix representing the capacity of your brain is 10,000 trillion dimensions. And why could the brain only conceive of 3 dimensions?
So that's the thing. That's why they call it the curse of dimensionality, you know? Like, Jesus wanted us to experience 3 dimensions. And then eventually we all got to the situation where we were listening to the demons inside us, and the demons in the underworld, like Hades himself, telling us, like, hey, humans, why don't you further your understanding of the world? Why not add just a few more dimensions to your model? Why not just add one more layer to your neural network? And that was, in fact, our original sin. That was the breaking point for humanity. We added so many layers to our neural networks that, in effect, we achieved the same level of understanding of the universe as God.
That's what Babel was about.
That's what Babel was about.
Too many layers.
Too many layers.
Do you think we're repeating that mistake now with residual recurrent neural network architectures?
So I mean, I don't know how else to understand these maddening results everybody keeps getting on ImageNet. Like, it's almost 100. Like, we're so close to rebuilding Babel, and God will not take us light. God will not accept this.